So what I'm going to talk about today is evolution, and I feel like I'm going to give a full-throated kind of defense of what evolution is and also what evolution is not. It's a very controversial issue, and hopefully we'll kind of broach it in a gentle way, but an intellectual way. And that's probably all I can really say about it. As a biologist, what I can tell you is evolution is common sense to us. And it is actually common sense, I think, to probably everyone in this room if you really think about it. And what I'm going to do is just give you a couple of examples of evolution as not this kind of scary, crazy communist plot, but just the idea of what evolution is. And I'm going to start off with this kind of classical example of the peppered moths. And I would guess that some of you have heard of the peppered moth story. I'm going to walk you through it in about a minute and a half or so. What it is about is these two different appearances of moths. And where this comes from is well over 150 years ago. There were observations of these moths that are actually pretty much all around the world in the northern hemisphere. And they have two different appearances. They have this appearance that is kind of mottled and pretty light, and this much darker appearance. And what had been noticed with these moths, called biston, I can't even pronounce genus species names, I don't even try. So essentially this moth, what had been noticed was historically people had recorded that the kind of common light-colored moth was the most kind of common appearance of the moth. And around the turn of the century 1900, what was noticed was most of the moths were dark. And people wondered why. Just as an aside, this moth also in the caterpillar form is a very good mimic of twigs. You might notice that's the caterpillar around a light plant, and right there is the caterpillar against a dark plant. So it mimics in terms of twigs, but it also has this color appearance. And this color appearance is genetically determined. We know that now, okay? We didn't really know it back then, but what was thought about was, why might this be the case? And the reason that this might be the case was around 1900, a lot of the trees, especially around Birmingham, England, had a very dark appearance. You might be able to see, it's right there, the dark appearance moth, and there's the light appearance moth. And over here, these are trees that are not growing around the industrial age or industrial kind of conditions. What I neglected to mention was Birmingham has quite the industry going on, or did have quite the industry going on in the 1800s. There are these lichens that would grow on the tree, and once again, well, here's the white and here's the dark, you can actually see right there is the light and there is the dark. Okay, what am I getting to? What I'm getting to here is these peppered moths were a great example of maybe some type of selective action or evolution in action. And some really kind of cool experiments by a guy named Kettlewell in the 1950s. He managed to grow up these two different varieties of moths and tagged and released them into the environment around Birmingham, where there was still quite a bit of industry in the 1950s, and somewhere else in England, which I can't remember, it's one of those shires that doesn't have pollution, and did the same thing and asked what happens after a season. And in fact, he managed to pretty much replicate that kind of result. That what happened was exactly what you would expect to happen. In the dark kind of environments of Birmingham, I hear Birmingham is not the most exciting place to live. I'm not sure, I've never been there. In those dark kind of barks, these things got picked off by birds really easily. And in the lighter areas, in the less industrial polluted areas, the darker moths got picked off. You can pick it off, and so can birds. And that's what happened when they collected the moths. So why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because that's really selection in action. And I want you to be thinking about this as we kind of go through a number of other examples. Another example is antibiotic resistance. We have bacteria. If you don't subject that bacteria to antibiotic, it will be pretty much kind of the same generation to generation. With the production, thank you, of antibiotics over the last 100 years, what you can do is treat with antibiotics, and you will select for populations that have increased resistance. And in fact, what you have right here is an antibiotic on this little disc, and you'll see everything dies around it, or apparently dies. If you scratch from right around here, there are still some cells surviving. And those cells, if you now transfer again and again, will acquire more resistance to antibiotics. Okay, other examples of selection that are quite clear, and these are artificial selections. So even if you're not with me, and what I'm trying to convey to you is, in fact, this isn't even controversial. This is just kind of clear facts out there that selection occurs. Okay? Artificial selection occurs and has occurred for the last about 10,000 years. At about 10,000 years ago is where humans started agriculture and started to congregate into cities and domesticate things like cats, cows, horses, corn. Not corn. Corn was a little bit later because it's a New World thing, and wheat and other things like that. Also, dogs. Dogs have been domesticated over the last 10,000 years. Dogs could originally, wolves would bite your arm off. Well, they wouldn't do that, but they would bite you. Now, dogs, they don't usually do that. And if you think about it, we've been selecting dogs quite impressively. I still love this research from about 2 years ago, which is that we're breeding dogs to be pretty and stupid. And there's probably some truth to that, but we'll just leave it at that. If you think about it, we're in the process of seeing species kind of come to life, new species. We're not quite there, and the reason we're not there is it takes a while to get there. But here's a little Chihuahua, and here's a big kind of Dalmatian mix. Those two, it's hard to imagine them having it's hard to imagine them having sex, but it's also, that's just not going to work. However, if you do those things, we can get involved in that and create actually a mating between them. These are still the same species, but they're not capable of mating out in nature. And in fact, if some of you have boxers, a lot of boxers can't even be born. They have to be delivered by cesarean section because of how we've been breeding their kind of proportions. So what I'm trying to get at here is changes can happen and happen pretty quickly. So let's kind of go back now over, thank you Wikipedia, you gave me sort of the whole what's going on with life in the last 4.6 billion years. What can you imagine? You can imagine 10 years pretty easily. You remember what you were doing roughly 10 years ago. Do you remember what you were doing 100 years ago? Well, very few people in this room do. But you can probably imagine, you've heard stories about 100 years ago. My grandparents were alive 100 years ago. I heard stories about that. So, okay, tens of years, hundreds of years. You know what? I'm even willing to go back 1,000 years or 10,000 years. We have recorded history. We know things about maybe 10,000 years ago when domestication started. That is so little relative to the history of life on the planet. We can only imagine, let's say, 10,000 years back. But we have 360,000 times that of time that has passed. And what I want to convey to you is time, we just can't imagine it. It's so, so long. And so, so much time has passed that even little things that seem really unlikely might have happened. And so what I want to kind of bring to this is probability. So the mathematician from University of Paris, Emile Borel, said phenomena with low probabilities did not occur or do not occur. And the creationists jumped on this. This is about 120 years ago or thereabouts. And the creationist says any odds of something happening 1 in 10 to the 50th, and what that means is 1 with 50 zeros, so really, 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 really unlikely. Okay, the probability of that is 0. The probability of that is not 0. The probability is 1 in 10 to the 50th. Let me give you an example of that. Although the probability of a photon emitted in the Andromeda galaxy, 2.6 million light years away from here, of reaching your eye, that probability is 8 times 10 to the minus 51. However, we're all able to see the Andromeda galaxy. Maybe not. Maybe you need some binoculars or something like that, but you can see the Andromeda galaxy. Photons from the Andromeda galaxy are hitting your eyes. So this thing that is incredibly unlikely occurs. And the reason it occurs is because there are billions and billions and billions and trillions, and I can't even think of the words, of photons being emitted by the Andromeda galaxy, and some of them just happen to come in that little surface area of your eye, and that's why you're able to see it. So, whoops, I skipped, I gave it away. Assume you could play the Powerball once a day every year that life has been on the planet. Assuming 1 in 187 million odds, which is, those are the odds for the Powerball. That's why I always play it when it's worth like 200 or 300 million. What the heck, even though I know it's still ridiculous. Okay, how many times would you win? 16,000 times. So something that seems just infinitesimally rare, really unlikely, has happened thousands of times over the period of Earth and life on Earth. So these really rare events can happen quite often. So if something is really improbable, it still could very well have happened. And that's what Dr. Hazen was talking about at the last session, that in fact these things might seem incredibly rare, but they could potentially happen over billions and billions of years. So where are we? We're at low probability events could happen quite often on the planet. We also know that we can change traits, and we call those, I have to use a genetics term, phenotypes. We can change phenotypes pretty readily over maybe just 10, 20, 40 years. We can get a really big shift in phenotypes. And all kinds of things that we can think about have evolved. So let me lay out for you what evolution is through natural selection, and that's the Darwinian theory. Evolution through natural selection is there is individual variation. Look around this room, everyone looks different. That's the simplest variation. But in fact, biochemically, everything you can think about, there is variation when it is genetically determined in some way. That variation is important. There are more organisms produced than are required for replacement. If you have one bacterial cell, say an E. coli cell, and you allow it to replicate, it would take over, and I wish I had done this calculation, but I didn't, you would have trillions and trillions of E. coli cells 2 or 3 days later. We are not all in wash of E. coli cells. There are limitations. People, okay, if we continue to replicate and replicate and replicate, we would, have quadrillions of people. I feel like I'm saying all kinds of crazy words here, but essentially there are limitations. We do not always have just what's required for replacement. There are limited resources, and there is a struggle for existence. Some of these individuals don't reproduce. I happen to not have any children. I am irrelevant to evolution. Makes me sad. It does make me sad. Okay? And individuals that are better suited in their environment to reproduce, they're going to do better. This is Darwin. This is what Darwin presented. I have to tell you, this is why as a biologist, when I think about it, nothing here seems really crazy. This doesn't seem like, yeah, there's variation. There are more things made than can possibly survive and continue, and there's some kind of selective pressure. Artificial selection, what we do with dogs, is you have a litter. You choose the one in the litter that is prettiest and dumbest and breed it. And that's how we do artificial selection. The same thing's going on all the time. And so that's why I kind of bring up the quote from the famous evolutionary biologist, I can never pronounce. Help me, Adele. Oh, that sounds so much better. I kind of want to record that. Okay, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And what is nice is he was inspired by our Mendel Medal recipient in 1937, which I'm going to also avoid pronouncing. I'm very American with not a very good accent. Okay, so we've kind of talked about how natural selection is kind of logical, and we can get these changes. Microevolution, or the changes in the appearances of kind of individual species, no controversy whatsoever there. Everybody pretty much, it's a fact. You see it. You see it all the time. Where things get a little more controversial is the idea of macroevolution. And macroevolution is that natural selection causes accumulations or accumulation of differences so that you get new species. And this is where things get ever so slightly more controversial. Biological evolution has produced the diversity of living things over billions of years of Earth's history. Okay? That's, personally, I'm fine with it, and I think a number of people in the room are. This is where I just wanted to kind of bring up the idea of really, actually the Catholic Church in particular, because here we are at Villanova, has no real issues with this. There's no conflict between the faith in God and the evidence for evolution. And if you think about it, science is a very materialistic kind of thing. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not the Kardashians, but essentially it is very physical. And faith is not necessarily really a physical type of thing. It's a spiritual thing. These are different. They're just different ways of looking at the universe. And typically, religious denominations that literally read the Bible as a history textbook, that every single fact in that book, Bible or whatever text, is literal, that's where individuals obviously would have some conflict with evolution. Well, evolution doesn't sound like what I'm reading here. And that's the literal type of thing. Okay, feel like I'm going to start sweating here because we're going to get more and more controversial, okay? So this is the Gallup poll that is taken every year. And the Gallup organization asks this question: which comes closest to your views? Humans developed over millions of years, God guided. Humans developed over millions of years, God had no part. Or number 3, God created humans as is within the last 10,000 years. Now, why am I saying this is controversial? Well, first of all, you can see, because you are capable of reading, what proportion of individuals in the human population which they agree with. I personally, and as a biologist, I should not be doing social science. I have a problem with how these questions particularly are worded, because honestly, if you say humans evolved, God had no part of the process, and you're an atheist and you're fine with evolution, that's probably it. If you are a theist, you believe in God, it's really difficult to say humans developed over millions of years and God had no part. There's a conflict there. And so I would argue that, in fact, in both of these groups, evolution's pretty much fine. It's hard for an individual who believes in God to say, yeah, no, God's irrelevant. I can understand that. Okay, the sweat has subsided. So essentially, what I want you to think about is, really, there are a lot of individuals who do not accept evolution. And I don't understand that necessarily as a biologist. But I do understand where it's coming from. And what it really comes down to is, I'm not an ape. I have morals. And if that's the case, you can understand I'm not a chimpanzee. That's essentially where I think some of this comes from and why maybe some people get kind of freaked out or upset about this. Okay? I don't think it's really that big of an issue, but this is where it's coming from, I think. So some of the arguments against evolution is, oh, evolution, that's not a fact, it's a theory. It's a theory. I'm sure it's just like, yeah, I'm theorizing that, so-and-so is dating so-and-so and that kind of stuff. That's not how it works in the sciences. In the sciences, we're a little more explicit about our terms. Facts. Facts are data. Chimps, bonobos, and humans all share 98% of our DNA in terms of it's identical to one another. It's pretty kind of cool. All organisms that exist use the same genetic code from simple bacteria to people to plants to whatever. Olfactory receptors, there are 900 genes in humans and 1,500 in mice. We'll come back to that later. Okay, theories. Theories are a framework where we put these facts. And in science in particular, the meaning of a theory is a very rigorous thing. It must be based on facts and it must give us testable predictions. And so a current theory that we have has no equally acceptable alternative. So there have been no observations made which contradict the point, and every observation we make is consistent with that theory, or at least doesn't say, nope, that theory's crazy. And other theories out there, germ theory, heliocentrism, quantum theory, theory of evolution through natural selection. It really is on that level. So what we're at is Darwin said there's variation, there's more offspring than can survive, there's some principle of slight variation that, if useful, is preserved. And what we can really think about is these changes that we easily observe, antibiotic resistance, moths being picked off of a tree, over millions and billions of years. It doesn't seem that unreasonable. And so what I want to do is just give you two examples of kind of evolution in action that are near and dear to my heart. Lamarck. Some of you might have heard of Lamarck. He was kind of around the same period as Darwin and kind of disputed, kind of made fun of in some ways. He was a scientist. He just had different opinions about how evolution occurred. And some of them were a bit of a problem. He always thought that nature had an innate striving to become more complex. And we as humans actually have a bias to this. We tend to see complexity, and we tend to see patterns towards complexity. If we're aware of it, that's our bias, that's okay. This is my big dramatic wrongo, okay? In fact, what we think evolution does through natural selection, based on everything that we know, is that lineages will become simpler or more complicated depending on whatever selective advantage they have. And again, you're going to see examples of this. Okay, let's talk about increasing complexity for a minute. Increasing complexity. Let's go back 3.6 billion years ago to that first early life. it's really hard to imagine what it is. And in fact, I feel like Dr. Hazen sort of avoided it, and guess what? I'm going to avoid it too. Because it's really hard to imagine whatever happened. It obviously doesn't happen on a daily basis. And what was it? The general theory out there is it's RNA, and RNA able to replicate itself. Once you have RNA able to replicate itself, it can have some changes, and it might do it better, and it might be able to incorporate other things, and you start to build complexity, which I'll get back to why it's not always more complex. But pretty early on, we had something called purple sulfur bacteria, which you can sort of see as purple. These bacteria, or their long distant grandchildren, great-grandchildren, those purple sulfur bacteria still exist on beaches, and some are aerobic, some are anaerobic, meaning they're with or without oxygen. What they can do is they can absorb infrared light or heat, well, sort of heat, it's kind of just on the edge of visible light, and they can generate energy from that. They have some protein that is able to absorb light coming in and make energy from it. That's a really cool invention, okay? And I can't help myself, I still anthropomorphize, because it's just so easy to think of things going towards this. But, so I apologize, and I'm gonna try and reel it in, okay? So we got, 3.4 billion years ago, the making of energy, the making of cells from the energy of the sun, that heat. The first, I think, kind of cool innovation is, imagine you have this protein that absorbs light. What if you could somehow get it to absorb visible light instead? These light harvesting complexes evolved. And they evolved, if you think about it, over a 700 million year time frame. Just so much time. That complexity, this is sort of what it kind of looks like. That earlier complexity of those kind of sulfur bacteria gets even more complex with what we call the Z scheme in photosynthesis. And I like photosynthesis, so I like to show that it gets really complicated. So more and more complexity allows for this process of water splitting. Light comes in and it splits water. When you split water, which is H2O, you get oxygen, you get O. And that oxygen created a really interesting environment for the Earth. Oxygen does, it actually oxygenates things. Okay, that sounds bad. What I'm trying to say here is, you've probably heard of antioxidants. You should take antioxidants. Oxygen can oxidize things and really create some kind of interesting chemistry. In that early Earth, oxygen was evolved because of light, and immediately it reacted with all the dissolved iron that was sitting in the oceans. And what happened is it rained down, and I'm going to, is this the lights? I just went crazy here. Okay, sorry. I was going to make it darker, but what you can see is sort of bands of iron. These bands of iron are a consequence of that very first evolution of oxygen in the oceans about, I forgot, how many years ago? 2.7, thank you. So that oxygen, you're awake. I'm impressed. So that oxygen gets evolved and immediately rains down these rust bands. Okay? I put up rust here because iron, we know now, reacts with oxygen and turns rusty. But when you have a ton of dissolved oxygen in your ocean, you get these really beautiful banded iron formations. And that was some of the first evidence that oxygen was being evolved, and you can isotopically date these rocks and figure out when did that happen. So, okay, that seems fine. what happens when all the iron in the ocean, or most of the iron in the ocean, rains down and soaks up all the oxygen? The oxygen goes into the atmosphere. And about 2.4 billion years ago, the oxygen started to go into the atmosphere. If you were an organism that had never seen oxygen before, and suddenly oxygen was around, while we need oxygen and I need to breathe it, if we had never seen oxygen before, it would be just like sulfuric acid or something really, really toxic. And in fact, it was kind of the first die-off of everything. Everything kind of died off except for some of these things that evolved oxygen, and they were allowed to grow. You can imagine for a while there's a ton of cyanobacteria. And what would be great if you were some kind of bacteria or organism that could eat cyanobacteria, you were at the ultimate smorgasbord. And you could just eat like crazy. Now, this is not the next step, okay? Let me preface that with famous evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith. No biologist, and I'm one of them, imagines that complex structures arise in a single step. Okay? Many millions, hundreds of millions of years pass before these simple little kind of things that have flagella and can swim around and have mouths and can eat these cyanobacteria appear. But you imagine that there's a selective advantage to anything that can get a little bit more of that cyanobacteria in its mouth. Cells can lose complexity as well. We tend to think of complexity because we are self-absorbed humans. I'm glad we're self-absorbed. We like to protect ourselves, okay? But not everything is building to complexity. Some things do the reverse, and in fact, we even do the reverse. We have 900 olfactory genes for olfactory receptors, and mice have 1,500. Well, why do mice have more? That doesn't seem fair. We're more important. Well, we're not when it comes to, we have eyesight, and guess what? We don't need to smell as well because we can see things. And so what I want to tell you about is opsins. And I'm going to talk to you about the Old and New World monkeys. Now, I admit I'm going past dinosaurs, but I've already conferred with Todd Jackman. He's let me talk about this. So the Old and World New monkeys. There are, most of the monkeys that you know of are Old World monkeys, chimps, gorillas, things like that. There are some New World monkeys that I am blanking on, howler monkeys. They're in South America. Okay, there was, based on molecular clock analysis, there is predicted to be a separation between them. They last shared a LUCA, last common ancestor, between 30 to 60 million years ago. That happens to be when these two continents were much closer together at that point. And it's thought that the division pretty much reinforced that these monkeys stayed away from these monkeys and were able to kind of evolve over time. I'm going to talk to you about the opsins. The opsin genes are the genes that are in your cones when proteins are expressed that detect light. And it happens to be that almost all mammals are dichromatic. They can detect two different light colors. And those light colors that they can detect are generally blues and greens. Now, I apologize to the couple of men that are probably in this room that are colorblind. That sucks. Sorry. But everybody else will enjoy this, okay? Those few men that are colorblind may not see any difference between these two images. Many of you probably are able to see the difference. The fact that maybe those tomatoes or those apples have a deep red color and look different over here when you only have two color vision versus three color vision. Another example here is you can see some differences in colors, but see, like those colors you can't really pick out if you don't have trichromatic vision. Old world primates and humans, so old world primates, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, I'm forgetting others, but they have trichromatic vision. The reason that they have trichromatic vision is we've sequenced sequenced DNA to find this out. What they have and we have are 2 copies of this opsin gene on our X chromosome. And this is why I apologize to the men in the room. Happens to be an X-linked trait. And X-linked traits, and I promise not to talk genetics, but I am, men are affected more by X-linked traits. Okay, so these 2 genes are on the X chromosome. And what is really cool is these 2 genes are really almost the same. They're 98% identical to one another. And if you have just one amino acid change in the protein, okay, what you will do is you will get a shift from the red to the green. It will absorb at a different light wavelength. And that's why this will have a different function from this. Okay, think back to everything I said about variation, natural selection, etc. One little change, well, that seems like that's possible. Maybe that could be a 1 in 100 million chance. That's possible. One change of one amino acid in an entire big protein that allows for you now to detect green as opposed to red. All the mammals only have the red and the blue. And just so that you know, we have blue, green, and red cones, okay? And then you also have rods that detect a slightly different color. This is how we're able to see what's up here and what's around us. So what was I saying about this whole thing of, oh, what does that mean, different colors out there? Well, these different colors are useful. New World monkeys have more olfactory receptors than Old World monkeys. And that is thought to be because Old World monkeys and humans have the ability to see colors. And those colors are really useful for detecting red fruits or new shoots of plants. We are able to see those color differences. We don't need to be able to smell whatever's coming from the new shoot or what's coming from the fruit. It's kind of a whole balance, and I feel like now I'm going to get to social science kind of. Wow, I sound like I don't like social science. I do. But, you know, I'm sounding a little squishy here, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Of essentially, maybe it's, you know, well, if you don't have this sense, your other senses get more strong. You know, you hear about that if you go deaf, you can see better. Or, I don't even know what I'm saying, so I'll just stop. Okay. So Old World monkeys essentially have the ability to have this trichromatic vision. Now what's really cool, deep sea fish, they don't have trichromatic vision. You sequence the deep sea fish genome, they only have just one opsin, and it's even shifted so that it detects really, really blue light, because that's the only thing that gets all the way down through the water. Even cooler, birds have the ability to see an additional color independent of all of us. They can see UV light. We can't see UV light. It's blue, 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 and then it's kind of gone. We don't see it anymore. You shouldn't look at it because it'll burn your eyes out. But essentially, UV light can be detected by birds. These all are really kind of consistent with selective conditions. Anybody want to guess what percentage of human males are colorblind and what percent of chimp males are colorblind? How many, anybody guess about humans? Humans are 8%. 8% total males. That's due to a number of different things, but about 8% of males are colorblind. about 0.1% of chimpanzees are colorblind. Now that's based only on a study of about 200 chimps. You can't go out and look at 1 million chimps because there aren't 1 million chimps. But it makes sense that if you are colorblind, you probably can still have children. You probably still are great. Nothing's really wrong. Okay, you can still procreate. Chimp males, they can still procreate too, but if you can't see where the richest food source is, there might be a selective disadvantage for you. You may not get fed as well. You may not get, the nice big stomach with all the fuel so that you can go and have lots of mates. Okay? So you see selective pressures everywhere. Okay, so what I kind of wanted to leave with was two things. Evolution through natural selection. I don't think it's nearly as controversial as you might think it is with all the kind of political words out there. There's individual variation, more offspring than can possibly survive, and there's some selective pressure on what is there. And this leaves me with, I want to kind of emphasize the idea of the power of selection. And I'm actually going to talk about somebody who is very kind of verboten, I feel like to talk about, because he's a rabid atheist, okay? And this is Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. And, I don't agree with him, okay, in certain ways. But intellectually, he certainly has some important things. And one thing that he came up with was this argument of, okay, something is incredibly improbable. Incredibly improbable. People will argue it never can happen. Now, we've already gotten to the point where things can happen because there is a lot of time, but let's take this phrase, which is what he chose from Shakespeare, "Methinks it is like a weasel." The argument is you get a chimp in front of a typewriter and you type and do that, okay? It's a kayak commercial with a brain. Has anybody seen that? I'm sorry. Okay, so it's this, okay? What are the odds of typing "methinks it is like a weasel"? So based on a keyboard, the odds are very, 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 very low. Now we've discussed, I guess we could go through 10 to the 50th options potentially somehow and maybe get this, but that's not like that's DNA or RNA or a living cell or all those kind of things. It's going to be more complex than that. And the original argument is essentially, what are the odds that a chimpanzee will type an entire Shakespearean play? Well, that starts to get incredibly ridiculous. And what Dawkins essentially argued, and I totally forgot to open this, so it's going to take me 10 seconds to open it, is the power of selection. If you think about it, when something like trying to type out the entire Shakespeare, that's just crazy. But if we have selection, if there is an advantage to each of those steps, things can happen incredibly quickly. So what I said with this was, "Methinks it is like a woozle." This one we've changed to woozle instead of weasel. And what we've done is we've taken 50 tries. 50 tries to type this out. Anywhere, any individual where something has gotten the right thing by chance, we'll keep that. We'll take that individual and we'll do 50 more tries from that individual. And if we see it work, well, we'll keep that. Okay, so now I've just given you that the odds of typing this out by chance are about 1 in 10 to the 50th. It's just never, ever, ever going to happen. And just like, come on. Usually goes a little bit quicker. That, there it goes. We got it. After just 317 generations, we got all of those letters to be correct. What we have is, here's variation. We choose out of that the one that looks the best. And we do it again. And we choose it. And boom, just like that, this time 101 generations. Wow, we just got something that should randomly take 10 to the 50th, just never ever happen. And because of selection, we can have it happen like that. So that's how I'm going to close. I'm done.